Hello, hello. All right. Um, Today we're getting into the second part of the Forging a New Nation lecture. This is going to be lecture 10.1. I'm sorry, 10.2. This is, like I said, the second lecture for test number two. Um, Last time, we started with Shays Rebellion. We wrapped up with the Bill of Rights. This time, our key points are George Washington, the Whiskey Rebellion, the election of 1796, and the Alien and Sedition Acts. Um, so, today, what we need to get into and kind of get really started is the first key point. Let's talk about Washington. All right. Um, George Washington was our, of course, first president under under this Constitution of the United States. He would be unanimously elected by the Electoral College. All right, the people would not elect him. He would be appointed by the Electoral College. Um, Kind of a background, a little bit. He was a slave owner, farmer, um, military man, politician, president, entertainer. Um, that was one of his favorite things. He was very much a homebody. He loved Mount Vernon, his home, where he would spend every minute that he could his entire life. Any time that he was anywhere near Mount Vernon, he would always make sure he'd be home for supper. Um, like I said, he was a entertainer in that he loved parties. He loved entertaining people. He would love large groups of people to come over and eat and drink and dance and do those kind of things. And he was also um, a early American version of Martha Stewart. He was always redoing Mount Vernon, doing different wallpaper paintings, um, china sets, tea sets, furniture. He was just fascinated with keeping up the home. All right. Um, Washington, however, is most important for us and for what we're talking about is with the presidency, right? Um, as the president, George is the one that establishes how everything worked. That is his huge importance and the focus. All right. He is the one that decided to be called Mr. President, not His Highness or anything else, but Mr. President. He would serve as president for 2 terms. He would be elected by the Electoral College both times to be put into office. And not only did he establish the presidency and how it kind of functioned, he also established the cabinet, the president's group of advisors. Of course, we all know the cabinet. You have the VP, Secretary of State, Secretary of War. Nowadays, we call it the Secretary of Defense. Um, Back then, you also had the Attorney General, the Postmaster, and the Secretary of the Treasury. All of these were very important positions in different aspects of what the government could and should do, right? And he pretty much had a dream team. His VP was John Adams, Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. Knox was the Secretary of, War. You've got Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury. You have all of these heavy, heavy hitters from the founders that are involved in this original cabinet. Um, but this cabinet is where we get the beginnings of the political parties. Um, you see this often throughout his 2 terms, this disagreement between two main people, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. These two men hated each other, they despised each other on a personal level, and held completely opposite political beliefs. Hamilton was a Federalist that believed in a strong national government that wanted a debt for a nation, that wanted to have a national banking system. And then you had Jefferson and his Republican beliefs, the idea that any national government would end up being tyrannical, and that the American federal government need to be very, very careful and try to stay as small and unimportant as possible. So you have this idea of what would become known as the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, right? This idea of large government versus small government. And that would be a big, big thing to fight over. And the government size and power with this debate would be led by these two, Jefferson and Hamilton. Also, other things to think about is during Washington's time as president, we would have what's known as the Whiskey Rebellion. This would occur in western Pennsylvania. All right. Whiskey was a very important currency for the most part for average Americans. Very little coin or precious metals were out in circulation, and in places out in the country, out in most of America, a lot of times people were paid in whiskey. So Hamilton and the federal government decided to tax whiskey more. And in the end, especially in Pennsylvania where this happens, they did not like this idea. The whole idea of taxing whiskey, they referred to it as a double tax. All right. Whiskey is corn and water, mainly distilled, and the farmer had already been taxed on the corn. So if they taxed the whiskey that came out of it, it'd be taxing that corn again in their eyes, and it would be a double tax, which shouldn't be legal. And with this increased heavy tax on whiskey, this upset the Westerners, the frontiersmen, the people that lived in the countryside that were farmers throughout the U.S. And they went back to old ways. They started burning down tax collectors' houses or places that rented to them. They would beat these people. They would strip them down and tar and feather them. They started protesting the way that Americans had always protested before. And with this, this really kind of is the first major test of the American government. Hamilton believed that Washington should organize an army, go in there, and put down this rebellion and show the world that our centralized government worked, it was functional, and it could take care of itself. Also, though, you had Jefferson's side. Jefferson did not want this. Jefferson did not think that we should put this rebellion down. To Jefferson, this was well within their right to protest. What they were doing, even though it was violent, to Jefferson, it was still an American right of protest. So the cabinet goes back and forth over this and fight over the fight, whether the government should step in or stay out of it. And finally, Washington decides to step in. Jefferson gets really worked up over this and ends up resigning from the cabinet and going back home to Virginia. So we've got Washington, we've got his cabinet, we've got this formation of the executive branch and how it would function. And his first major real test of In the end, they would go to put this down, but by the time anything happened, the protests were pretty much over. And everything had kind of gone back to normal. Farmers do not have all the time in the world to piddle and protest. They got real work that needs to be done. So by the time the federal government got there, it was basically over. Also, the next key point, the next thing that you guys and gals need to know is about the election of 1796. All right. With the election of 1796, this was a huge thing. This would be the first time that the American population would vote, which meant at that time white men that had enough land. All right. You had to be a white male, but you also had to own so much land to be able to vote. So in the election of 1796, for the very first time, the white American landed male would participate. With this would become a big event, and the two main people would end up being Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. And Adams would end up edging him out. So John Adams would be our second president. Back during this time, how it worked is the person that came in second place in these elections would become the VP. So you had John Adams, who was a Federalist that believed in a strong, centralized government, as the next president. And you had Thomas Jefferson, who was an anti-Federalist that pushed for a small federal government and more powerful state governments as the VP. This was a big election in another way. This would be of huge importance and symbolic importance. The president, of course, is the main figurehead of this government. He would be the leader of the armies. And as far as an individual, be one of the more powerful in the American government. And during this time in history, this idea of electing and putting people in and taking another out was untested. This idea of a peaceful transfer of power, they didn't know if it would be possible. I mean, when the time came and the new president was elected, would George Washington just give up all that power and go home? Or would he stay and fight for it? I mean, this idea of a peaceful transfer of power was a huge, just jump into the darkness. Because people in power had never given it up in Europe before like this. And what would end up happening is pretty straightforward. When the election was over, Adams was the president. Washington was more than happy to give up the reins of power. He even left before it was supposed to. He was tired. He was done with being president and went back home to Mount Vernon and lived out the rest of his life. With this, you have several big things. With this election of 1796, you do have this first, which is this peaceful transfer of power. The first time a large number of Americans actually vote and participate and elect a president. And this is a huge big deal. This is a big celebration. This kind of electoral process becomes the idea of voting and going to vote and being a voter. This election week would play a big role in the 1800s and be as much celebrated as Independence Week. So we've got George, we've got the Whiskey Rebellion, we've got this election of 1796, and now we need to talk about the Adams presidency. And this is what we'll wrap up with. It'll be a quick one today. John Adams would be president from 96 to 1800. He would only be a one-term president. All right. He would not be a two-term president. His presidency was just a horrific battle for him. Um, Nothing tended to work right for him. Everybody was against him, it seemed, and nothing he could do really worked. I mean, he was the guy that followed one of the most loved and celebrated men ever in America from then till now. So he had big shoes to fill, and it never did go well. All right. Just remember, Adams was a lawyer, a rebel political leader. He was a very important leader in the rebellion. He is one of the ones that helped, with Jefferson and Otis creating some of the most foundational ideologies in American politics. He would be an ambassador to England and France both during the war. He would also be a vice president and then finally the president. Um, During this presidency, we've got two things to really talk about. Near war and our last key point. All right, during the 1790 time frame, even before, even under George, his presidency. So throughout the 1790s, America was having huge amounts of trouble with the British and the French. Both of them had started doing impressment, which were taking American ships and goods and sailors on the high seas and forcing them into their armies. And we were losing citizens, we were losing goods, we were losing all kinds of things. And the biggest thing was that the British and the French just did it with impunity and ignored us when we asked them not to. Under the Washington presidency, John Jay would create a treaty with the British to try to stop it, but this would rile up the Americans, that the American government would even talk to the British this close to after the revolt, upset a lot of people. And we also have trouble with the French. All right. If you want to, you can get into it. It's a really interesting adventure into American foreign policy. There's a thing called the XYZ affair. All right, and with the XYZ affair, this would put us very close to the brink of war with France. And this is another thing. In the American political circles at the time, the Federalists tended to lean more toward liking and agreeing with British, and the Anti-Federalists, like Jefferson and the others, were hardcore Francophiles. They loved the French, and the French were going through this revolution to overthrow the monarchy and become a democracy as well. So, in this time, we had this Federalist president, John Adams, who was more of a Brit lover than a French, right? So he would be put into these situations with the government of France that did not go well. And what Adams would end up doing, he did not want to go to war because we had no army. We had no real way of fighting. But he would end up basically starting up what would become our Navy. And it was meant to be a protection for the Americans abroad. Another big thing that would happen are the Alien and Sedition Acts. These would be pushed through and voted through by the Federalists, who were the main powerhouse in both houses of Congress. During this time, you have a lot of animosity toward the French over this XYZ affair, over this possible war, over this impressment and all these other issues. And we create the Alien and Sedition Acts, which is your last key point. And these Alien and Sedition Acts are unconstitutional. These are one of the first examples of the overstep of governmental power in American history. All right, we have The Naturalization Act, this is where the federal government made it harder to become an American citizen, especially if you're from a place that the federal government deemed scary or unwanted. And at this time, of course, that would mean France. You also had the Alien Act and the Alien Enemies Act. And between these two, this meant that the president could deport or imprison people from a foreign country that is considered to be hostile or not an ally of the American government. So, this gives the president a lot of power. It gives Congress a lot of power. And basically what this was doing is trying to shut up people that supported the French. And also to give warning to the French within American borders that they could just be picked up and sent back into France just like that. The other is the Sedition Act. With the Sedition Act, what you have with it is that basically, let's put it this way. It becomes illegal to say anything what is considered to be false, scandalous, malicious, or against the federal government. So, if you say something that the government deems false, scandalous, malicious, that can arrest you. This happens all over the place throughout the new states. Thousands of Americans are arrested for slandering the government. One example, a garbage scow captain in Massachusetts was drinking at a pub one night, and Adams was coming back home to Braintree, Massachusetts for a visit, for a vacation, and the places, the Boston was celebrating. And as they were firing cannons, the guy said, "I don't care if they fire a cannon through his ass." And people heard it, they turned him in. He would serve time in jail and be fined for that. And you have other serious cases. But what you've got with the Sedition Act is the federal government basically taking away numerous rights from the Bill of Rights, right? So this is a major issue throughout Adams's presidency. Finally, when Jefferson comes into office, these Alien and Sedition Acts would be gotten rid of because he deemed them unconstitutional, and this is one of the things he pushed in his campaign, that these Federalists were overstepping their power, becoming tyrants. So we kind of got a brief history, a brief start of things, in the 1790s with our first two presidents. In the next lecture, we'll pick up with all of this and really kind of hit Jeffersonian America. And this is a formative time frame. The Jeffersonian America is going to cover quite an extent of time. And because he plays such a huge role in shaping how American government functions. All right. So, you've got your key points for the day. Washington, the Whiskey Rebellion, the election of 1796, and the Alien and Sedition Acts. So, everybody have a good afternoon, and I will see you in the next video or in the classroom.